The meanings here are given in order to sort of cheat in the syllabus in the sense that I don't say, well, I'm going to get to them. And the reason for that is that I don't know. Not because I can make up days and say I'm going to do this thing. But until I know you better, I really can't know precisely how long we need to spend on some of these things. And I'll try to give reasonable time things so that, strange as it may seem, I would like very much to, for you guys to understand what we're reading, and that may take a little bit longer in some cases, a little bit less time in other cases. So I'd like to keep a little bit of flexibility there. So at least in the summer, that's what I've done. This will be the order in which we will look at things. You will notice that we begin with English Romantic verse, that is this volume here. And I asked you that it was, for my side, to look at several of those writers who once upon a time would have been called pre-Romantic writers. There are other terms for them, and I'll discuss those. But some of those who in the later part of the 18th century sort of led the way in certain ways, or anticipated in certain ways, the sort of full-fledged romances that began developing with William Blake and Wordsworth. We continue with English Romantic verse, which I abbreviate to ERV, in the second B reading, the next group reading, and those will focus on William Blake. I won't have more time to deal with Blake. He's a very important figure, but I will only deal with him in a somewhat selective way, but we will spend a bit of time on him. Then we come to Wordsworth, and this is the volume of Wordsworth's selected verse that we return to, and the readings will be pretty substantial, and the time we spend will also be very substantial. You remember my little sort of plan last time, which was to cover all of the major romantic poets, but to cover one of them in sort of detail because of the wide range of work, and Wordsworth is sort of a handle for that. And so when we get there, we will sort of tuck in for a good long stay, because he is really a very, very great work. Then we return to the English Romantic verse volume, and they look at Wordsworth's collaborator and friend, Simon Coleridge, with the major exhibit there being, you could almost expect, on the ancient narrative of the English works as well. Then we return to, not return, but then to the one complete work that we will meet, which is part of gigantic romantic satire. It's hard to come up with a precise term for doctrine. That's one of the things that's supposed to be romantic about. It's sort of everything. But romantic satire, at least, is a shorthand term for what perhaps do. And we will be here for considerable time. Then we end with two major, not the end fly, but come to the end of the major phase of romanticism with two important poets, both of them died much too young, and that is the selections in English Romantic verse from Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats. The last section, the literally last section, deals with what might be considered the sort of dying fall of romanticism. Just as romanticism was not born overnight, it did not decline overnight. Now, that is when Keats and Shelley died in 1821 and 1822. Romanticism did not stop at that point. There was actually a great gift that was provided, and I've given some of them here, not all of them, but a substantial selection of them, who really carried on the romantic tradition, but with declining force, I think it's fair to say. Something new was clearly in the wind, something that by the 1830s was going to produce a new phase of literature in the 19th century. That would, as I said last time, not leave romanticism totally behind by any means. Well, we really developed into something recognizably different from romancing. And that was, of course, the Victorian movement of the last two-thirds of that. What marks these writers as interesting is that they work very hard to remain committed to a kind of pure romantic program at a time when most literary culture was going in other directions. And perhaps because of that, because of some steeping romances in the world was becoming increasingly something else, their production is very interesting, but it is also limited. And it's very interesting, at least to me, and I hope you sort of realize the human aspect of the sort of art of romanticism. Because when you look, I think romanticism in its essential nature is a high-risk way of living and writing. It just is. It takes chances. It lives with its heart to some degree on its sleeve. You know, I sometimes thought that romanticism is inherently bad and depressing. That is to say, romanticism is always dealing with highs and lows. You know, the classical periods of culture, and especially neoclassicism, which came right before romanticism, tends to deal very little with the ecstatic heights of possibility and very little with the, what can I say, the tragic depths of human possibility, and you try to sail itself in what might be called the moderate and humane middle, and stays there as much as it possibly can. So that even when it deals with tragic things, it deals with them from a sort of comic point of view. And if you don't know what I mean by that, just consider something like Swift's modest performance, which comes from the height of the classical period, and was he dealing with poverty and misery and starvation, and how does he deal with it in a satiric, ironic, and comic, although darkly comic spirit. Same thing can be applied, of course, to Gulliver's Travels generally, which has to do with all kinds of really terrible things. I defy anybody to read it without laughing, more or less, from the beginning to the end. And that's pretty typical of neoclassical. You know, even if we deal with harsh things, deal with them in a spirit of rational self-control, and that is typical of neoclassicism. Romanticism deals things deeply, whether it is the great highs or the great depths. One writer was a kind of transition figure, who has sort of 1 foot in the neoclassical age and 1 foot in the romantic age. We will not be reading it, but he's an interesting figure. His name is Horace Walpole, son of an English prime minister, great letter writer, and in fact the father of the Gothic novel. That's how he has sort of been the development of romance. You know, the Gothic novel, all those novels that deal with those novels, things that go on in the night and all that. He made things, things like Dracula and Frankenstein and even the Three Wuthering Heights. You might think that that's very modern or anything, romantic development. It really was. It was an 18th century development. And Horace Walpole in his novel called Castle of Otranto, which came out in the 1760s, is the beginning of the Gothic novel. But he says something that I've always thought very profound about the difference between neoclassicism and romanticism. He said, life is a tragedy for those who feel and a comedy for those who live. Think about it. Life is a tragedy for those who feel and a comedy for those who think. I think it's fair to say in broad terms that the neoclassical age was for the most part a thinking age, and therefore a comic age. Its typical ways of writing are satiric, ironic, comic, give an example I have, I hope will mean something to at least come of you. A great art historian, Sir Kenneth Claw, did a book many years ago, 30 years ago now, called Civilization, the sort of traces Western civilization through art, through the visual art. And when he gets to the 18th century, the neoclassical age, he entitles his chapter on neoclassical age, The Smile of Reason. Smile of Reason. And what he gives is, on the page right next to that chapter heading, he has a Rudolph sculpture, a Rudolph bust of Voltaire, great French neoclassical writer. And there's old Voltaire, straight from the operatic candy, that very laughing, satire, all terrible things of life, you think you're around, you cross one of your eyes, let me show you. Lady in the sea, and candy, but you made it through. There again, the laughing sort of quality of the neoclassical age. But Kierkegaard shows a sculpture of Voltaire. And old Voltaire is an old man in this sculpture. He doesn't have any teeth left at all. But he's turned around, blind, and he's turned around, and his sort of old man's grin is in to say, I've seen all there of life, and I'm amused by it. No matter how it is, it amuses. That is not the romantic spirit. That is not. The romantic spirit is heartfelt. It is throbbing with passion. It feels life's ecstasies and life's tragedies with equal intensity and passion. That's what romanticism is all about. It is, as I say, sort of inherent, bad, depressed, as we would say. It knows great heights and great depths, and we will find that all the way through. Now, you can almost tell from the way I was discussing romanticism that to some degree romanticism can be seen as a kind of reaction against neoclassicism. Now, I don't mean that in a mechanical way, like you have neoclassicism and there has to be some degree of that being bomb, like sort of to every action, word reaction, there's an equal opposite reaction. That's not what I'm getting at. But I think if you look at the history of culture, or the history of literature, or the history of the arts, the history of anything, what you will see is that in one period, certain things, certain values, certain ways of looking at the world are seen to be natural, inevitable, they make sense. In the Middle Ages, it makes sense to view everything from the point of view of eternity, the point of view of faith, the point of view of God, the point of view of sort of theological philosophy, which they call ecclesiastical philosophy, or scholastic philosophy. That's seen as natural to them as computers, highways, and electric was. See, well, every age has things that seem inevitable, natural. That's the way it is. The only trouble is the way it is. What's natural, what's inevitable, is constantly changing. And the Middle Ages, it was one thing, an age of faith, an age of trust. It seemed just as natural for them to build thousands of Gothic cathedrals that took 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and sometimes 1,000 years to build. They were all for the glory of God, as it does to us to build the Sears Towers and the Empire State Building, which are surely cathedrals engraved of money. One see the natural in the Middle Ages, the other see the natural in us, perhaps. They're obviously based on a totally different view of the world. Now, after the Middle Ages, what followed was a kind of reaction in which a world that was defined purely in spiritual, theological, divine, Christian terms no longer seemed big enough. There needed to be more, something a little bit more basically human, something that dealt with the ordinary passions, the ordinary experiences of life in a more colorful and intense and human and concrete way. And there needed to be more knowledge about that and examples of how to do that. How to think about political reality, how to think about emotional reality, how to think about personal reality, all of that stuff. And so what you get, of course, is that great period of culture that we call Renaissance, in which the rediscovery of the classical past is carried on. That is, classical Greece and Rome, not because they were interested in just going back and breaking all that stuff, but because they were living for models of how to live life fully on a human and secular basis. Now, that does not mean that Christianity disappeared in the Renaissance. It most certainly did not. But it was blended with another great force that you can call Renaissance humanism. That involved a new definition of reality that was combined sometimes harmoniously, sometimes not so harmoniously, with the Christianity beliefs to produce a new culture. All you have to do is look at Dorothy from the Middle Ages with his vision of life that is all in terms of infinitude, eternity. For not only where is reality, it's inferior, purgatorio, paradiso. That is, it's hell, purgatory, and heaven. That's where reality is to be found. That's it in the Middle Ages. When Shakespeare comes along, who is perhaps the greatest poet of the Renaissance in Europe, where does he see reality as being? Look around. See human beings from top to bottom and east to west. See them in all the complex human reality. We do not have a single Shakespearean play that takes place in hell or in heaven or purgatory. His vision is not up and down, is across. It's latitudinal, looking at human reality in an ordinary sort of human way. That's typical of the Renaissance. Do you think any other Renaissance writer who looks the world pretty much that way? They all do. Poetry is one great exception. How about, to move across the water a little bit for me, but how about another great Renaissance writer, the Spaniard, Cervantes? He's very much looking at the world as it sadly is, isn't it? I mean, and in fact, couldn't you almost say that the whole problem with Don Quixote is that he, God bless his heart, can't bear to accept the mundane reality of the world. So when his windmills become giants, Dulcinea becomes a Spaniard, that's the rest of the kind of mind games he plays on himself, so that he can live in a world of romance. They're supposed to remind us that we're living in a world of very human reality. We have Sancho who's constantly saying, he is master of life, and telling him, of course, about the harsh and common realities of everyday life. The Renaissance was, in every possible sense of the word, whether you're looking at literature or you're looking at just general culture, there's a period that was expanding, moving, changing. It was incredibly dynamic. And sometimes, there's that joke, isn't there? Where was supposedly Chinese curse like, may you live in interesting times. It's supposed to be perfect. Do you see why living in interesting times might be perfect? I don't know about you, but I like to live sometimes in boring times. Why would that be? In boring times you have wrong. No great happiness, no great conflict, no great war, no great, earth-shattering changes in things. There's something to be said for that, believe me. But the Chinese curse, indeed it's the Chinese curse, certainly, may live an interesting time. Could easily have been lived without the Renaissance. I suspect it was the most intensely interesting period you could almost in the whole history of Western civilization have. But it was also a period in which the problems of exploring the world, the problems of intense warfare in every national direction, things like spectrum, all that. After all, the Bible, one of the things that comes to the Renaissance for the year are things like tremendous numbers of people who learned to establish Spanish Inquisition, the burning of witches in this country, basically in that sort of tail end part of the Renaissance. People felt intensely about everything, and they fought out those intense disagreements in very bloody sorts of ways. It was energetic, it was creative, it was profoundly interesting period, but it was also a period in which conflict, violence, and violence were very much wild. All you have to think of is some of the monarchs at the time in England. The two most important Renaissance monarchs in England were Henry VIII. Actually, if you really look at Henry VIII as a historical figure, it's very interesting historical figure. There is much about him that's intelligent. There's much that is highly cultivated. He was very much interested in what he saw as England's best good, what was good for England. But in order to bring about those supposedly good values, he had to do a lot of pretty nasty stuff. Sometimes perhaps a lot more nasty than he needed to have done, although he would have argued on the other side. If you're thinking about, as I dare say, Henry VIII's many wives, and the somewhat tragic history of those wives, you have but one example. That is only one example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. And then even somewhat later, greater Elizabeth I, what does she have to do? She ends up in her life having to, at various times, probably the two men that she cared the most about to death, because they were politically inconvenient to her. And finally, a close kinswoman whom she did not want to have to death, but finally felt that she had to do that. Elizabeth first finally she was Scottish. Married the Queen of Scots, yes, you get the idea. Well, she wasn't mean exactly, but the political realities were so stressful and difficult and unsettled at the time that it was necessary. Many of the writers of the time emphasized this. They emphasized the fact that if you think of tragedies during the Renaissance, things like King Lear and Macbeth, and bloody tragedies like the White Devil and or the Duchess of Malmedy or the Revenger's Tragedy or any of those, they were full of revenge and blood and strange forms of death. And all you have to think of is Hamlet coldly contemplating the skull, that he finds when he's out in the grave digging scene, and it turns out, of course, the last poor Lord, I knew him well, follow him into the jest, This is what it all comes to. What did he finally say? Go to my lady's bedchamber, tell her, let her paint and itch think, yet to this favor will she come. And the sort of skull beneath the skin, the sort of horror of death lurking around every corner, was the sort of dark underside of the sort of glorious Renaissance that was there. That's reflected throughout the culture of that time. It was a stressful as well as a highly creative time. The neoclassical age came after that. Here at Anderson's 50-minute survey of Western civilization. But the neoclassical age comes afterward, and I think we sometimes misunderstand the neoclassical age. It did not get all dry and wrinkled and gloomy based on a kind of hyper-developed rationality. In other words, it did not turn into a bunch of rational philosophers who thought reason could solve every problem whatsoever. That's a stereotype. That's not what happened. But what it did try to do was to restore human culture and restore human art to a somewhat more common sense and reasonable, middle-of-the-road, balanced sort of reality. It felt that it can understand things to a serious degree through the exercise of the analytic reason. Whereas in the Renaissance it had been much more a matter of sort of will and determination and Machiavellian cleverness and all of that. But in the Renaissance, in the neoclassical age, what was that again? In England, about 1660, the neoclassical began. It happens in part because Charles II, who was the victim of one of the surges of Renaissance energy, which we call the English Civil War. And of course, he wasn't the big victim, Charles II. His predecessor, Charles I, was the big victim. In fact, what happened to Charles I? Yes, he lost his head, you might say, over the Renaissance. He was beheaded. His kinsman, and should have been successful, Charles II, had to go away to France. While he was there, on what he always originally called his trial. He was not traveling. What was he? He was in exile. He was hiding from his enemies back in England under all the Parliament and so forth. But eventually all the Parliament died. And the problem then becomes, gosh, how much more society, because it was a sort of guru of the Commonwealth, of the Puritan Revolution, is dead. What do we do? And it sort of shows that they didn't quite know what to do, that they tried to make the son of all the sort of next, we don't have a king anymore, now we've got to come up with a way of ruling England. I guess we'll use the son of the leader we have, as if he were to be interesting. But it turned out that Richard Palmer was a miserable disaster, son-in-law. And so it was time for a change. And most of the people in England that want these people that are influenced them, it is what we want is we want England back. We want the realm of England, the kingdom of England back. And so the question became, can we bring back Charles II? Will he return as king? And he, of course, said yes. And he did come back in 1660. That's called the restoration of the English monarchy. And with it comes the restoration of the English monarchy, but really the development of neoclassical literature in England. And why did that happen? Because when Charles II was over in France, he was at the court of Louis XIV. And Louis XIV, the royal son king, was not only the great monarch of Europe, he really was. He presided over the most powerful nation in Europe. But it wasn't just powerful in military or economic terms. It was also cultural, by far the most powerful nation in Europe. It was producing writers like Molière, and Racine, Monet, and Lafontaine, and Molière. These names, some of them maybe mean something, some may not, but trust me, they're important writers in their own way in France. They called the kind of style they were developing in the middle of the 17th century French classicism. And of course, this became neoclassicism in England, when it was sort of transferred or came over from France on English soil. This is not a class of neoclassicism, obviously, but rather its successor romanticism. So I'm going to have to do a very, very superficial job of sort of suggesting what neoclassicism is all about. But the writers that England produced, neoclassical writers, are people like Dryden, people like Poe, people like Henry Fielding, people like Samuel Johnson, people like James Boswell, people like Lawrence Sterne, people like the great historian Gibbon, some of Western writers like John Gayman, there are a lot of them. And it's a very rich period, a very important period. And it lasts for a long time. Its essential domination of English literature lasts from around 1660 to roughly 1800. And it is in this context, this neoclassical context, that the first elements of Romanticism began to develop. Partly, no doubt, as a kind of reaction against neoclassicism. Because neoclassicism was powerful, it was useful, it was highly creative, it produced a tremendous body of art, architecture, music, and literature that was of tremendous value. But like every other age that has ever come along, it inevitably sort of paralyzed will place great stress on certain things and a whole lot less stress on other things. Now, what did it value? It valued on the whole common sense and reason over imagination and feeling. That's an oversimplification, but basically speaking, it is true. It valued clarity and structure in almost everything he did, whether it was architecture, thought, or literature, over spontaneity and sort of coloring of highly individual modes of expression. It valued city life over country life. If you really know his great play, Cartoon, you may remember that there is precisely one reference to the countryside in all of Cartoon. And that is when Elmar, the father of the household, returns to the country and his brother-in-law, Leon, greets him at the door and says, basically, I'm translating here, he says, "How was the country, brother? Blooming, I trust, and green." That's it. That is the whole principle of the countryside in the whole way. If you know the poems, the trial, the poems of the poem, I think you'll agree with me that there is very little intense feeling for nature. There is almost none of that in crime and very little of it in poems. If you think about poems like, I'm trying to think something like read the survey poems, something like Tribesman Flintstone, which obviously deals with the buying of sort of conditional literature in the 17th century. That really had much to do. In fact, it's all about London and where the Thames flows and all the rest. And how about the Great Law? Best known one. It doesn't deal with country at all, except an occasional reference to the Thames flowing through the countryside between London and Hampton Court. That is to say, two sort of city-fied, cultivated places where all the real action takes place. Also, the literature of the neoclassical age puts a lot more emphasis on what might be considered discursive, intellectual, and philosophical matters than personal, emotional, private sorts of matters. If we're used to poetry today, here we are, for better or worse, as sort of, I will look into my belly button and tell you what's down there. I mean, there's more than that. I'm not just being silly. There, in 20th century poetry, for instance, we have a major development in modern American poetry in the 40s and 50s called the confessional school of poetry. And poets like, say, Robert Lowell in the 20th century, or Sylvia Plath in the 20th century, are obvious examples of that. And then, of course, unlike those two poets who are really quite distinguished, we have 8 million zillion undergraduates who, well, I'm afraid at a considerably lower level, are convinced that their latest emotional crisis is sort of literature without doing much to it. You know, all we're going to do is just write it down with a lot of exclamation points and so forth, and you've got instant literature. Well, as the kids say on the playground, it used to 2 or 3 years ago, not. It tells you sort of where, you can often tell what the condition of literature is by looking at the bad as well as at the good. And we have a lot, I'm afraid, of all read stuff, about my latest emotional crisis, or whatever it may be. You may not have found that in the neoclassical age at all. The poets of that age viewed the public work, the philosophical work, moral idea, as where a poet ought to be. So, for instance, as some of you will know, what does Poe do when he is a very brilliant and young poet? He devotes himself to the writing of what which he calls an essay on criticism. If you know the essay on criticism, you will know it is not an essay in our sense at all. It's a poem about the elements of criticism. It begins. It's hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging it, but of the two, less grievous the offense to tire our patience than mislead our strength. You see, it's an essay in what? In verse. And when he gets more mature, he writes an essay on an even bigger philosophical issue, not literary criticism this time, but what he calls his essay on man. And that, too, is by which he means mankind. It's not in the sense of wrong. What does he say there? He says, the proper study of mankind is man, for the life of it. A place on his Basilian state of being darkly wise and brutally great. Talking about a mixed nature, humanity. It's brilliant. It's wonderful poetry. It really is. But it is poetry of ideas, poetry of discourse. The same is true of Dryden, to a very large degree. Dryden begins one of his finest poems this way. Well then, the fullest hour is come at last. The present age of wit obscures the last. Our sighs were strong, and as they walked, they writ. Witted by force of arms and dim to wit. He writes a poem in which basically talks about the shift from what we would call the Renaissance to the Neoclassical age. So they were strong, but they didn't have the elements. That's really what he's talking about in that element, and what he was all talking about. In other words, it's poetry that deals with ideas, with concepts, rather than with personal feeling. There's not much personal feeling in Dryden, but there's a lot of fun in Dryden. When Dryden begins one of his poems like this, he says, this is absolute Kenneville, on his first poem, where he says, in pious times every scrap began before believing was made a sin, when man on many multiplied his kind. And what he's doing is kind of creating a never land of sexual promiscuity in which a king like King David, when we talk about the Bible, is okay, and a king like Charles II, who was also pretty promiscuous, and that's what he's really like about, can also be okay. But it's funny, it's historical, it's intellectual. You were not going to find Dryden telling you about Dryden's latest emotional crisis, or what it felt like when he fell in love. If he ever fell in love, he didn't write it. Pope didn't write it either. Pope's much more likely to talk about it's a pretty poem in which it sounds like conversation. For instance, and one of the most brilliant ones, this is the art. He's talking about being tired. He's talking about how he's gotten to be a famous man and everybody wants to come and see him, and he doesn't want to see anybody anymore. So what does he say at the beginning of this poem? He says, shut the door, good John, fatigued, I said. Tie up the knot and say I'm sick, I'm dead. Belongs to you too. I mean, tell him, go away. I don't want to see anybody. Tell him I'm sick. Tell him I'm dead. Tie up the knot. What do you mean by that? Put a sort of bandana or anything around an office so they won't knock. Tie the knot or say I'm sick, I'm dead. The dog star rages, bathed and passed all down, all bedroom on asses. It's let out. In other words, the dog's going to top, and of course, what's supposed to happen with the dog star rage? It's pretty hot. Constellation involves serious. It's like in July, things are got too hot, people go nuts, and what do they all do? All Bedlam, which is where they kept the lunatics, all Parnassus, which is where the voters were supposed to live, is allowed. Fire in each eye, angels in each hand, they wave, resign, and man around the land. You know, suddenly creates this hilarious satiric vision of a world inhabited by mad poets. Wasn't familiar with it. He did. Look at this. And he said, shut the door. I want to deal with these people. Leave me alone. It's a spring. It's not exactly, though, what we expect of poetry these days. It's because, well, the main reason it's not what we expect is that we are great-great-grandchildren of, guess what? The Romanticism. Now, when Romanticism began to develop, what form did it take? Well, I think it's fair to say in certain ways, and we can look at some of the works that you read last night, it is looking for some alternative to the neoclassical world. The neoclassical world was civilized and elegant and polished, but then he was a little bit too civilized for some people. That is to say, wouldn't it be nice if we could at least occasionally get a glimpse of something wild and primitive and strange instead of things that are civilized, elegant, and rationally understand? And that was one of the impulses, I think, that in other words, a kind of longing for, or a hunger for, the primitive, the heroic, the wild, the romantic. This is really what the word romantic originally meant. It's simply been something that was beyond ordinary, rational certain consideration. You could have a romantic landscape that is one that was too wild. No, it was not like a garden, but like a kind of wild, great mountains and soaring trees, and that could be a romantic landscape. And that's the way the word was originally used. Or you could have a romantic feeling, but what that meant was it was originally not a positive thing at all. It meant a feeling that was not properly governed by reason, by intelligence, by decorum, and so on. And you'll find in many 18th century novels someone saying, oh, don't be romantic. Being, of course, don't be extravagant. Don't be foolish, don't be silly. That's really what the word in the 18th century mainly meant. If you read Jane Austen, who lived in the romantic period, but was not romantic at all. In fact, she was British. However, most of the movie makers try to make her be Smith was. She was a classic neoclassical sort of life. And if you have really read one of her novels, you will know how true that is. First, it's just the beginning of Pride and Prejudice. Does anyone know the famous sentence? It is a truth universally acknowledged that a young man in possession of great fortune must be in want of a woman. Now, there is a romantic view of marriage, isn't it? No. It is an ironic, humorous, comic view based on the idea that most marriages are marriages of want. Material, for better, for worse, they are. Now, of course, there are ways of escaping that, and Elizabeth Bennet, to some degree, does escape that. But she is the one who does. Others, not so much. Charlotte Lucas, that novel, settles and explains why she settled. And all of you settled for that miserable virgin couple that she married. You settled, haven't you? Nothing wrong about that. Or you've done something like Northern Rabbit Bird's parody of the God of God. She makes fun of the romantic novel and her heroine, Capricorn. She says at the beginning, there was a nothing of heroine in the appearance or the line or the behavior of Capricorn. No one have qualified her for a romantic heroine. And in fact, there isn't. She's a tall, prosaic little girl who has convinced herself that she is a romantic heroine. And in fact, the whole novel is a kind of satire of romantic self-delusion. If you read or you've seen the movie Sense and Sensibility, there you have it. Sensibility is the sort of romantic tendency, but it doesn't go too far. Sensibility is okay. A little silly thing about prison. But you notice the girl in the novel, the sister in the novel, who represents sensibility, there's no, in fact, in them very the handsome, dashing young man she thinks she's romantically attracted to, but she marries a stable, decent, honest, older man who in fact is not terribly romantic, but is very decent and good as well. And of course the other sister never for one moment thinks about the things that are romantic terms. So during the later 18th century, what you get is neoclassicism moving on to a very great degree to general culture, general literature. In fact, it's Samuel Johnson. Some people read Samuel Johnson. who is very neoclassical, very much neoclassical, dominates Henry's call by many writers the great chair of literature, which means the great, say, great law of literature, the great emperor of grand wizard of literature. And the fact that he dominated the last half of the 18th century tells you that neoclassicism did not go away. The fact that Jane Austen is still alive and well and brilliant and productive in the early 19th century, at the same time as Wordsworth and Coleridge and Byron are writing their poems, tells you that neoclassicism did not go away, even after monasticism had pretty much gone today. Well, there was strong impulse. What is, as I say, this search for the primitive, the wild, the heroic, that of course the neoclassical civilized age did not really satisfy. Was there anything you read last night that very clearly reflects that love of the wild and the primitive, the longing for it? See, over about Thomas Gray, Thomas Gray, he has the distinction of having probably written the single most popular one poem in the English language. I say that because it has been widely printed, translated, read, and I apologize that any other poem in the English language. It's not one of the ones that you read. What's his most famous one? You know, that's Harry. Gary Roosevelt, that's 17th century. But very well, here's how it begins. The curfew tones the knell of party day. The rolling bird flies slow. The plow and homeward plows his weary way and leaves the world to darkness. It has a few famous lines. Far from the matting clouds in over strife, the paths of glory lead them to the grave. 16. It really is tremendous. It's called the Elegy in a Country Church. That's how it's written. Yea, we do know it. That's good. But it is a very important book. Now, if we look a little bit more at Thomas Gray, what do we find? This was a man who was in many ways straight 18th century. He really was. He had a formidable classical education. He was probably the best educated man of his time. Either Samuel Johnson or some toss point between. He had read everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. He read Latin and wrote it for just as easily as wrote it. Greek, same thing. French, Italian, German, Scandinavian tongues, including Old Icelandic. He was a scholar of profound learning. He also was probably one of the most learned naturalists of the time. He wrote about flowers. It was just a tremendously learned and very much an intellectual, very typical. He was a scholar. He was officially a scholar. That is, he was a professor, what we would call a professor, what they would call a fellow, at Cambridge University, and lived most of his life in the cloistered halls of that great university. And he was a civilized, urbane man of the world and culture. You read his letters and you think, the 18th century, with all its civilization, all of its urbanity, with all its intelligence, its learning, that's the 18th century. But then you pick up this volume, and here's Thomas Gray, and the first poem you've got is The Fatal Sisters. What the devil is the Fatal Sisters about? Well, you know, from the Norse tongue. Now, it's not literally a translation. What he's done is he's taken elements of Nordic or old Germanic mythology, and he has written a new poem roughly in the style of Nordic poems. These are very primitive sorts of poems. It's really close to things like, what is our version of English of Nordic or Old Germanic literature? I mean, of the Dark Ages, of the early Middle Ages. We have versions of that in English stuff. You can read one, I bet you. The Werewolves, is an example. The Wanderer, the Seafarer, the Dream Blue, things like that. The poems he's looking at here are even older than that. They are really from the Dark Ages, and they go back to big, legendary, old Germanic, old Norse sort of legend. Can you guess who the Fatal Sisters are here, basically? Let me give you a hint. The Fatal Sisters here, those maidens in German legend who will, of course, preside over battle and go out and swoop up the heroes who die on the battlefield and determine destinies of battle. And of course, in Wagner's Germanic legendary mythic opera, he is with music is communicating around in the memory as they go to gather up the dead heroes who died, but to take them all to Valhalla, the sort of Nordic Germanic heaven for big strong heroes who die in battle. This is not the neoclassical 18th century. This is not a drawing room. This is not Mozart. This is not elegant, civilized love. In fact, what are these Fatal Sisters like? Here, they're like, do they like you anything else other than the Bible? Let me read a little bit of it. I'll be done. Now the storm begins to lie, haste the loom of return, iron sheet the average hour, aliens in the laughing band. Is this the Yes! Bubble, 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 and of course there we have the topic, the supernatural, the strange, the bizarre, and also the mind, right? Glittering glances on the room, where the dusky warpy strain, weaving may as soldiers do, work each road, low and ranger's name, every man obviously soldiers, warriors, who are going to die in battle. Now they are weaving the sort of texture of destiny here. And what do they weave it out of? God, I don't know what people thought of this when it came out of the 18th century. But of course what Gray would say is, I don't mean it to be taken all that seriously. I'm simply recreated as a kind of antiquarian game. The vile, heroic legends of the mythic early medieval past. Of course, I, as a civilized man, don't have any great interest in such a thing. What does that allow him to do? Have fun. That is to sort of dive off into the wild, violent, heroic past and escape the elegant, civilized polish of his own faith. But listen to this not only in terms of what it says, but how it says the rhythm, the movement. And notice how far we are from different glittering textures of the silk, different religious textures. That's the poem's account of the silk, you know, in the great Milan. Or is it the great account of Belinda, who putting on her makeup when she trembling begins the sacred rites of God. That she puts on her makeup, and here what the elephant and tortoise unite for transform to colors, the spectacle. What happens to elephants and tortoises? They're made into ivory colors and tortoiseshell colors, so the beautiful girl. But that's the world of the 18th century. Nice china, nice silver, beautiful architecture, Mozart in the background, and everything is beautiful in the garden. What is that? What is Gray meanwhile doing, sitting in campers there? What kind of dreams has he got? See the grisly textured wall, 'tis the human impulse made. This is not elegant at all. This is horrifying. And the weights that play below each a gasping warrior's head. And it goes on in that sort of theatrically bloody, vile, heroic, riveted sort of way that let's get down and say, hey, restaurant, shafts for shovels dipped in gore of gold. Shoot the trembling cords along, sword that once a mile more, keep the tissues close and strong, miss the black, terrific maid, and he means literally terrific, that is terrifying. Sangre, what was sangre? Sangre, Spanish, or you can say, and he is the joy of the wayward work to aid, 'tis the roof of victory. That is, they're weaving the texture of the future there. Also, in this sense, it reminds one a little bit of the destinies in classical mythology. Weave the destinies of future, that sort of thing. What we're going to have here, in other words, is real blood, heroes, Valkyrie, bloodshed, and following all that appeal to an over-refined, elegant professor of modern letters and history at Cambridge in the European 18th century. Well, that's exactly why it was, see, as it did to, guys, this is the only example we have. Did you read anything else? For instance, that maybe suggested a law of the primitive, the heroic, and the law. Look at the brief selection from James McPherson, on page 51. This is from a collection of poems that McPherson published in the 1760s and 1770s, called the Poems of Ossian. Now, James McPherson is an interesting figure. He was a Scot. And he tried to pull a little hoax right here. He said, I have found the manuscripts of ancient Scottish, Bardic, Celtic poetry. And they deal, of course, with all kinds of heroic figures, of dark landscapes, romantic violence and passion, everything that he said it was. And he claimed that he had found these in various monasteries, and that he was going to edit them and translate them and then produce them for the public, which he did, as the Poems of Ossian. And all kinds of people loved them. Thomas Gray, for instance, loved them. Napoleon later on thought they were magnificent, thought they were greater than Homer instead of Calvin. There was only one problem. They were poems. McPherson didn't have very many of them, but not much. Celtic or Gaelic, the old sort of ancient languages of Scotland and Ireland, didn't have them. He simply made up his idea of what a Celtic or Gaelic bard they are. They tried to call themselves bards. They would call themselves wits. Men of the world who have a facility for writing verse. That's what a tall bard was a bard. We invite boys to hear the voice of the bard, who present, past, and future sees, whose ears have heard the holy word that walked among the ancient trees. That's a bard. It's about half poet and half sorcerer. There is a kind of almost Merlin thing. A figure who has magical powers of expression. It's what Coleridge talking about, isn't it? When he talks about weave a circle around and flies, for he on honeydew and bread, and trump the milk of paradise. His idea of poet is that he is divinely inspired and has supernatural powers of expression and creation. which are godlike. That's not what the 18th century thought. What did the 18th century bring poetry was most? True wit is nature to advantage trends, says Paul. Law was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. In other words, it's the ability to express things with elegant, precise, brilliant clarity and precision. That's what being a good poet is. That's what drawing about. That's what poets about. That's what science about. The best words in the best places. That we do. That is not what the ancient idea of the poet was. The ancient idea was that you were a kind of bard, a minstrel, a kind of, do you remember the Anglo-Saxon word? Where they were basically the historians, the magicians, the medicine man, and the storytellers in verse of their tribe. They called it in Anglo-Saxon shows, S-C-O-E-S. It was a show who wrote Beowulf, right, or who composed Beowulf. And what is our elegant 18th century poet trying to do here? Recreate something of that ancient bardic tradition. And how does he treat, well, one thing, look at the description of things, on page 51. Night is dull and dark. The clouds rest on the hills. No star, no twinkling beam, no boron, no moon looks from the skies. I hear the blast in the wind, the distant dawn, I hear it. The stream of the valley murmurs, low as its former tune. From the tree and the grave of the dead, the lonely screech owl roams. I see a dim form of a flame, 'tis a ghost, it fades, it flies. It ain't poetry or drive or Samuel Johnson. It's all about what? Cheerful landscape, cheerful thoughts, coats, garments, things that we're walking on, terror and all the rest of it. The 18th century was so civilized that every now and then it wanted to scare itself. Does this help explain why the Gothic novel first develops in the 18th century? I'm tired of reason. I'm tired of common sense. Let me imagine a ghostly picture that leaves. A ghostly figure clanks its chains as it goes to the Gothic towers of an abandoned castle and so forth. By the way, we call these Gothic novels, and in a way, these poems we're looking at are sort of Gothic poems in two senses. Not only Gothic because they deal with the sort of dark ages, but also Gothic because they represent a kind of cheerful, let me give you an example. In the greatest plays of the classical age, William Conrad has a young lady, Milligan, for example, who is being, what can I say, opportune and importunate. She's being sort of courted by a country bumpkin. And this country bumpkin keeps making advances which she doesn't want anything to do with. And at one point, when he makes one advance too many, she turns away from him, sticks out her hand like they're pushing away, and says, "Oh, you ruler than God." She is speaking using the word God in the true 18th century sense. That is, what did they think of God? He was rude, primitive, uncivilized, irrelevant, unpolished, and just downright stupid. It belonged to the Dark Ages, after all. What we have here in works we've just been looking at is a kind of reaction against that. With a kind of, maybe it's interesting to go out to the Gothic Middle Ages. Maybe there's something there in that primitivism that's fascinating. What is surprising to learn that postmodernism said life is a tragedy, those feelings, those things. In addition to being an 18th century man, was also, not just the father of the Gothic novel, but he was so fascinated by Gothic things that he built himself a little house down south of London Notice, not far from London, so he could go there when he wanted to. And he called his little house Strawberry Hill. And guess what he built? A tiny little pseudo-Gothic house for himself. And not usually when you see this. We sometimes get the idea, I think, that the literature we're reading all, just fell the North anthology immediately, and it's a conspiracy of English professors, or it became the England people edition. And of course, that's not true. The literature we're reading was real. It was printed in real time, read by real people, and so on. And so we're right now showing the real stuff. This is the 1757 edition, first edition of Mr. Gray's Odes. We're not reading either of these odes, but this is typical of his poetry, and it came out at the same time as what we're reading. And you'll see here, printed at Strawberry Hill, which was he had a private printing press for the printing of sort of interesting new literature that was coming out. And not everybody can see this, but those are from him. There's a little engraving there that shows Strawberry Hill, and it's a little Gothic castle where this was printed the first time. Surrounded, you notice, by sort of landscape and all the rest. The whole thing, really presenting, was printed in 1757, a kind of romantic view. And here's what these poems look like when they were first typical of the poems as they came out in the middle of the 18th century. Which is when Ray is mostly active. And so there you have that sort of longing for something primitive, something grown, something alive. That's one of the things that leads to the rediscovery of a kind of romanticism and the sort of reestablishment of a kind of romanticism. Secondly, the neoclassical age had put so much emphasis on a poetry of statement, that is, poetry trying to begin to reflect on, doesn't it? All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey. There's great strength to power, really, but does it tell us one thing? Would it ever occur to anybody to set back to music? I don't believe it was done. I can't remember. Why did we say anything? I want to pose one more here. Answer the question sort of, but give you some insight about it. Robert Burns will be one of the last pre-romantic poets we wrote. And what is he famous for? His songs. He wrote verses, and he had in mind traditional Scottish melodies to which they could respond. We'll read, for instance, one that is called, as some of you will know, Flow Gently, Flowery Banks of Bonny Dew. I didn't ask you to pronounce that. We'll get there. It's a song. It's a lyric. The poet God mostly like lyrics. Can you imagine saying, shut the door, Big John, petite guy said, tie them out and say I'm sick, I'm dead, no, it's not raging. No, it's not what happened. Why? Because the poetry is mainly talk. First of all, it exists on the level of statement. When you write a lyric, and when you want to sing, why do you want to sing? The Holy Spirit says, I sing because I'm happy. I sing because it's the expression of emotion. And so there is not much, as you could almost expect, there is not much lyric writing in the classical. But when romanticism begins to fall, or what we know is romanticism, they inevitably start singing. And why is that? Because emotion, right? The emotion becomes much more important. So when we read, you glory banks of Bonny Dew, and you win somehow, because he wrote in Scots, Walter Scott, He doesn't want you to read it. He doesn't want you to if all things are good, all hand wounds of faith. He wants you to have in the background of something if you'll forgive. If all revenge of from evil are each heart he little ones, eyes of hope, break my heart, I am so full of care. This is a long way from shut the door with John. I said, God, say I'll sing out it. The Lord's word, lyrical expression, which means song-like expression. When you sing a word like "oh," the word "oh" means basically a complex and elaborate lyric. Now, obviously, odes are not songs. We have that one verse, a good example, because it's straightforward lyric in the absolute sense. But odes are also lyric. In other words, they clearly, you have to have some sense of music behind them, some sense of emotion behind them. For instance, to return to Thomas Gray just for a second, when he is contemplating, look on page 11, the relationship between natural changes in the landscape and the more complex changes within human feeling, the human experience. He naturally writes an ode on the pleasure arising from vicissitude, means what we would call the ups and downs of emotional life. Now, the second stanza, newborn flocks in rustic dance, frisking by their feeble feet, forgetful of their wintry tramps, the birds his presence greet. Now he turns to the bird, and look what he says about the bird. The chief, the skylark, roars high, is trembling, thrilling ecstasy, and lessening from the dazzled sight, melts into air and liquid. He doesn't say, look at the bird. It's an interesting bird. It goes south in the winter. But he's interested in a kind of over-the-top emotional reaction to the bird. Are we going to have a lot of that romantic game? In fact, a skylark is addressed and described. The chief, the skylark roars high, is trembling, thrilling ecstasy. Not too much ecstasy. But here is the beginning of that sort of thing. Who will more famously address the skylark? Hail to thee, blind spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or near it, thou pourest forth thy heart in unpremeditated strains of art. Children will write to a skylark, and Keats will write to a nightingale, and Coleridge will write a poem called The Nightingale, and Wordsworth will write to a skylark too. It's not as famous, but it's a very fine poem. And in fact, how many romantic poets will address birds in one way or another? Why would they like birds? They fly up to heights, don't they? And what else do? They sing. It's perfect, isn't it? You're going to have a lot of birds going in romantic age. It fits. So the level of lyric expression, look at it Chatterton on page 53. It's more on page 53. Actually, I'm going to use one of these. I'll use 155. The minstrels. Notice the minstrels what? Song. Song. Lyric, right? It's meant to express emotion, intensity feeling. It is song-like. It is not poetry of statement, but poetry of feeling, and expression, and lyricism. Now, does anyone know anything about Thomas Chalmers? Very interesting to me. I said last time, being the last period, that he became sort of the poster boy of the whole romantic age. And he really did. Coleridge wrote a sonnet on Keats dedicated his album Endymion to his memory. Wordsworth refers to him at what we will look at in Resolution and says, I thought of Challenger, the marvelous boy, the marvelous sleepless soul that perished in his pride. Well, I'm afraid he did perish in his pride. He was 17 years old when he committed suicide. Now, why did he commit suicide? Well, I think in part because he was probably born in the wrong age. As a very small boy, he grew up in the southwestern town in England of Bristol. It's a seacoast town. And there's a beautiful Gothic church in Bristol called Mary St. Brendan's. And apparently from his earliest childhood, he loved that Gothic church. It reminded him of the sort of romantic possibilities of the Bible and Middle Ages and Dark Ages. And he, as a child, indiscriminately sort of wandered around and sitting and looking through the stained glass windows and contemplating the flying buttresses and all the different features of God and good. And eventually, when he got a little bit older, about 10 or so, he wandered around down in the basement of the church. And what did he find there? But some old books, actually from the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, that were in black letter, you know. It looked like the Middle Ages, and he learned to read sort of early English style written in Gothic letters, which he took to be medieval really well. He thought he was reading Middle English like Chaucer. No, he really wasn't. It was a little bit later than that. But it inspired him to a very great degree, and this really sort of boy wonder began to get the idea, what if there had been a medieval poet here in Bristol? Let's call him Thomas Rowell. Yeah. And then what if he wrote interesting poems, very different from what poet Brian Johnson would write now? They're medieval, romantic, lyrical, in a kind of Middle English. But of course he didn't probably understand it. Very few people do understand. Really, here we guess, what does Chaucer say about the little birds that small birds? Little birds, and he says, the small fool of a mock melody, that slave with all the deep, that is the small birds, the small fools that mock a melody. Take a melody and sing, and slave with all the deep, this is the sleep all night, which I believe is very well. Bit of natural history, but nevertheless, it's a beautiful line. That slave with all the deep, that's Middle English, that's real Middle English. It's all Middle English. Chadwick was drawn to that because it was such an alternative that he didn't really probably understand. Happily for him, not many of them in the 18th century either. They were interested in classical Greek, classical Latin, that they knew. Modern languages like Italian, Spanish, they all knew. But medieval languages like Middle English, Old Icelandic, Anglo-Saxon, well, they didn't understand or didn't know much about it. So he got away. What he did, he really did do it. He claimed that he had found, this is himself, what did McPherson do? McPherson said, I have found a Gaelic poem named Ossian, and here's what he did. He did. It was funny. But you can see why he wanted to. He gave him an excuse to write in a totally different way from what was typical in the past way. What does Thomas Chalmers do? Exactly the same thing. He creates a medieval poet who he calls Thomas Rowell, and then he writes things in a kind of pseudo-Middle English. Have you ever seen those signs in sort of quaint towns that say things like, he only shall be, you know? And it was that stuff. That sort of thing. So as related to Rome. Well, that was sort of Thomas Chatterton's approach to Middle English. He really didn't understand Middle English, nobody much did, but he wrote in a kind of semi-pseudo halfway antique plays out Middle English. In fact, many years later, Charles Lamb wrote romantic essays to wrote really that also, as he himself said, stuttered was looking at some of Thomas Chatterton's poems, and they were commenting on how he had made everything look old, adding ease to everything. And Charles Lamb came up and said, it must have been written by that model gentleman that wrote with ease. And it wasn't what the model gentleman wrote with ease. It's a whole line about the elegant poets like Herod who wrote easily. It didn't have anything to do with wrote with ease. But it was a kind of fun, kind of joke. I love explaining jokes. But anyway, that's what you say. Well, it is sort of the way Thomas Chatterton. But the funny thing is that underneath the sort of phony medieval Gnosticism, that is, he actually was a kind of genius. And you can tell that if you look at the minstrel song. Notice, just like Macpherson wrote what? The songs of bards, what we got here are minstrel songs. Now, what is a minstrel? You know, that's an American sort of, no, minstrel is a medieval poet who basically is, again, a kind of poet, people, a kind of, but he's a singing poet. The minstrel figure in all the legends, is it out today? Can't remember anyway. And there are minstrels, of course, minstrel figures in Arthurian romance and all the rest of the legends. Sort of poet who was a singer, a kind of early poet. And what was he like? Oh, singing to me on the way. Oh, drop the briny tear with me. That's not what I'm and right away with me. My love is dead, buried his dead bed. Oh, black his hair as the winter night, white his robe, which means his complexion. As the sea threw in a few long words that had been forgotten, both remembered, broken, so seen empty. But imagine, this was written when he was 15 years of age. Now listen to the melody of the words. Oh, sing unto me on the way, oh, walk the briny tear. Dance the warm holiday, like a running liberty. My Lord is dead, found in his deathbed, all under the willow tree. Black his hair is the winter night, white his robe is the summer snow, red his face is the morning light, cold he lies in the grave below. My love is dead, found in his deathbed, all under the willow tree. Sweet his tongue as the blossoms know on the blossom note, another morning. When we together in sort of environment, so say the birds, the song of the bird becomes much more important than it was in most neoclassical. Quick and dance as thought can be, deft as tabor, cudgel stout, oh, he lies by the willow tree, my love is dead, down to his deathbed, all under the willow tree. It's actually very beautiful, haunting, sort of weird, of the sort that I guarantee you, Holland, I love him, very, very cool. But he never wrote anything sound like that. His wife, he never would have thought of that. But Chatterton has the true sort of song impulse, the true lyric impulse. In fact, there's a reminding sound that it even sound at all. Anyone care to guess what it does sound like? Ever read a poem? But it's desirable to sing like worship. She said, oh, it's such a I see for it's a sad song out there, and romance and all the rest. The willow song, it's called. Or you know what, reading sleep. What is that called? My Lord. It's the rest. And he doesn't sound like the Middle Ages. He sounds a whole lot like Shakespeare's song. And that's mainly the influence that produced some of that. But that he can write this 15 really shows that not only he had real ability, but he also was looking for a new way of writing. A more lyrical way of writing, a writing way of writing. And how does he achieve that? By claiming that he in fact didn't write these things at all. That they were written by a Gothic monk of the Middle Ages. I'm sorry to say that eventually his imposture was discovered, and he was so distraught, so unhappy when it was discovered that he had, as I say, committed suicide at the sad age of 17. It's a great loss. I don't know how great it will eventually become, but there is no child prodigy, perhaps, quite so perfect as Thomas Chapman. And it's a shame that he died so young. If you look carefully at these poets that I looked at last night, I don't know how many of you are interested in what might be called, sort of psychopathology. That is to say, the psychology of artists. Well, perhaps artists are always a little afraid because they're a lot more sensitive than most of us. And so, there's sort of the, you know what I mean if I say the parents in the cave of life? That is, when people used to go out and work in caves, they always used to take a little parakeet with them, a bird in a cage, because if the gas got bad enough, what would happen? The bird would die before people did. They don't. I sometimes think that artists are sort of parents in the cave of life. That is to say, they know things are bad, but what most of us do, it's just struggle on. It's going to hell. Artists have a way of seeing that and feeling that and knowing that and expressing that, but they really feel it. And I think the evidence of that is these writers that I was looking last night were beginning to sort of explore new territory. And really beginning to suggest that maybe the neoclassical vision of life was not the adequate vision of life. They paid for being ahead of their time. Thomas Chatterton paid by committing suicide at age 17. Christopher Smart, what did he write tonight? I would say of my cat Jeffrey, for he is the servant of the Lord, whom he obedience to daily serving, and he can straddle upon the wagon, and though he cannot fly, he is an excellent clown. And so, have you ever seen a cat in such wild, mystical, strange, and bizarre ways? It's the greatest cat poem in the English language. It really is. Don't cat the poem on cat cat. And does it have anything to do with the neoclassical age? It does not. It is as strange, eccentric, bizarre, and wild as anything in the whole Romantic period. And Christopher Smart ended his days in a madhouse. He was died in an insane asylum. William Collins, who wrote the old unpoetical character, and the old deed, beautiful. They're all old style of pastoral reading, chase Eve to soothe listening here, and all that. What happened to him at age 30? He goes mad and ends his life in a lunatic asylum. Thomas Gray, though he was tremendously learned, was also tremendously neurotic. And for instance, he was trying to be professor of modern history in Cambridge, and he was a very learned man, as I've always said. Probably the most learned man in his time, but he was so neurotic, shy, and afraid to get out in public that in fact he was expected. It was really an ornamental sort of post. I mean, he was scared because he was such an important figure, but he was expected maybe once a year to actually deliver a lecture. He was in Cambridge for 30 years, and he never delivered the first lecture. He kept planning, but he never got around to doing it. I'm Frank Marr, a university administrator, and said, I don't see why he made better like that. I got rid of it. Very bad in Cambridge at that time, but he didn't want to put himself. William Cooper, looks like Calvin, was afflicted with such a deep sense of personal grief and personal damnation that as he felt that he had been singled out for some special damnation because black on black, he felt it kind of really very depressive thing about that he was intermittently insane for almost the second half of his life. When he was sane, he wrote some of the most beautifully sane poems in the English language. But if you remember the poem, Living in Insanity, or better yet, maybe, the poem called The Castaway, on page 48. Very interesting poem. He tells the story of the castaway of a sailor who swam overboard, right? And it's a very moving account. Poor man is left in the waves, and he knows he's going to die. The ship goes on, and he hears the cries of the men fading off the distance. He knows it's going to die. It's moving on that basis. But what really makes it interesting is that we end the poem just when you think, well, this is a sort of fair poem about man dies at sea. Which, by the way, is based on true accident, which we'll say at the beginning he dies. But watch what Cooper does in the last two stanzas on page 50. I therefore purpose not or dream discounting on its fate to give the melancholy theme a more enduring day. So he says, I'm not intending to make this event immortal by writing this poem. I didn't claim that. So why am I writing this poem? But misery still delights to trace its semblance in another's case. No voice divine the storm allay, no love propitious shown, when snatched from all effectual aid, we perished, each alone. But I beneath the awful sea, and one in deeper gulfs than me. And that same note is to be found, for instance, in the poem on page 42, lines written during a period of insanity. And what does he feel about himself? Hatred and vengeance, my eternal portion scarce can endure delay and execution. Wait with impatient readiness to seize my soul in a moment. Damned below Judas, more abhorrent than he was, who for a few bits sold his holy master. Twice betrayed Jesus, me, the last delinquent, deems the profanest, boundless of ours, and deity disowns me. So, this is a man, actually, he's man we see two things about. One is he's deeply troubled, and second thing is he's brilliantly articulate. That is, he knows how to express it with great power and great force. But he nevertheless feels a tremendous sense of anxiety. Look at, I'm about to shut up. On page 41, The Task, which is his most famous poem. And this is only one brief section. I was a stricken deer that left the herd long since. Just a very hauntingly beautiful beginning. In other words, what does he paint himself to be? The lonely, romantic, solitary, alienated figure who has lost contact with society. You may think you don't know William Cooper, but you do. Because among his other poems, and they came out of his feelings of insanity and damnation and so forth, he wrote along with a man named John Newton, probably the most famous hymns in the English language. And that is, they were written in the 1770s. They're called the Orderly Hymns by Cooper and Newton. And you know some of them, I guarantee you do. One of them by Cooper begins, there is a fountain filled with water. And of course, Newton is in his collaborator of those hymns called the Only Hymn for Poem, was written in the Northamptonshire only, is probably as famous a hymn as we have in English. what it why would that appeal to Paul? Because he feels himself to be virtually beyond the pale of hope. You might say, my God, what are you going to do? Nothing. The psychological states are not about things, and that's the whole point. You're getting a picture, and you're right to get a picture. But even though every one of these writers you've been reading today was given virtually all of them. Our name inside was pretty good. Almost all of them suffer so serious, horrible, woman called at least to some. Why would that be so? I never asked them about that, but I'd like you to think about it. For next time, think about the context, think about what the context, see if you don't come up with some answers. Next time, we'll finish that first group of writers. I realize I haven't dealt with them, every case, as Karen was about, we're going to do that next time. Also, if you would, we'll stick with that, but you will add Robert Burns, because I didn't give him last time, but I'd like you to add him. There's just about 3 pages that are Robert Burns. But I'd like to do him next. There we go. Here's the first edition of Cooper's The Past, which here, see, this is the one from which I was the strict and deer that left the herd. So there it is. It came out in 1785. And you can see it's a great long poem. I mean, a page of it, it's about 250 pages long. It's a great big poem. It's actually very, very good. So next time, on with the other big romantic poets, and then we'll strike on around down to midtown. See you next time.